The needle didn't jump because the earth moved. It jumped because the earth sighed. Arthur had been watching that needle for 11 days. 11 days of slow, mechanical patience. 11 days of iron-rich water dripping from the lip of the shack's tin roof. 11 days of hemlock shadows pressing against the porthole windows of the listener's nest. That strange 8-sided monitoring station bolted directly into the gray limestone skull of Sighing Ridge. He had watched the needle move the way a man watches a sleeping dog's ribs. Rhythmically, incrementally, with the quiet certainty that nothing meaningful was happening. And then it jumped. Not the frantic spike of a fault line waking, not the sharp, agitated scratch of a mine collapse. This was something else, something slower, something that moved the mechanical pen not with violence, but with the long, pressured exhalation of something immeasurably vast and immeasurably old, like a breath, like a sigh. Let me start at the beginning, because the beginning matters here. Everything here matters. Arthur Voss arrived at Sighing Ridge on a Tuesday in late October. His instructions had come from an agency whose letterhead had been blacked out with a thick bar of permanent ink. The job description was simple enough to fit on an index card. Monitor ambient seismic vibration. Log all irregular amplitude events. Do not leave the station unattended. 3 sentences. No name to call. No supervisor to check in with. Just a radio frequency, a weekly supply drop, and the understanding that Arthur, with his 22 years of vibration analysis, his calloused fingers from adjusting delicate mechanical arms, his tendency to hum low and tuneless to himself when he worked, was exactly the kind of man who could sit alone in a small room and listen to the ground without going sideways. The agency had been right about that. What they had not accounted for was what the ground might say back. The listener's nest had been built into the ridge itself, not on the ridge, not beside it. The shack, if you can call a precision-engineered octagonal monitoring station a shack, and most of the people from Hettrick County certainly did, had been drilled and bolted and poured directly into a natural limestone shelf about 40 feet below the ridge's cap. The floor was not wood or concrete. The floor was the mountain, raw gray stone, sealed with an epoxy resin that had gone amber with age and smelled faintly of the camphor oil someone had worked into it decades before Arthur arrived. The walls were corrugated steel, painted once in a flat government green and left to rust along the seams. 8 walls, 8 porthole windows, each about the size of a dinner plate, each now permanently fogged with mineral condensation. The ceiling was low enough that Arthur, who was not a tall man, had to tilt his head slightly to the right when he moved between the main monitoring desk and the cot pushed against the eastern wall. It was a small space, a concentrated space, a space that held smells the way a jar holds summer lightning bugs, trapped, faintly luminous, slowly dying. There was the smell of the limestone itself, chalky and cold, like the inside of a cave that hasn't seen light in 3 centuries. There was the smell of old machine oil from the seismograph assembly, a Warden pattern instrument bolted to a leveling plate that had been recalibrated so many times the adjustment screws had worn smooth. There was the smell of the paper roll, that continuous thin band of graph paper feeding through the platen at a preset rate of 30 millimeters per hour, gradually accumulating the mountain's whispered autobiography in a fine, ink-traced line. And underneath all of it, underneath everything, there was a smell Arthur couldn't name. Something organic, but not alive. Something wet, but not water. Something that reminded him, obscurely, of the inside of an old church, of old wood and cold stone, and the slow breath of a congregation that had been sitting very still for a very long time. He noticed it on the first night. He stopped noticing it by the 3rd day. That is how the mountain works. The first 8 days were routine. Arthur monitored. He logged. He ate his canned provisions and brewed his coffee on a single-burner propane element, and listened to the rain strike the tin roof in those long curtained sheets that October pulls across the hollows of Hettrick County. He filled 3 logbooks with standard amplitude notations. He slept without dreaming, which was unusual for him, but which he attributed to the mountain air and the steady, almost narcotic white noise of the ventilation fan. He did not yet know about the tapes. On the 9th day, he found them in the floor. Not figuratively, in the floor. He'd been sweeping up limestone grit. The ridge shed it continuously, a slow, perpetual dandruff. When the broom handle caught a seam he hadn't noticed before, a hairline crack in the epoxy resin, running in a near-perfect rectangle about 2 feet by 3 feet, flush with the stone. A trapdoor, sealed with a turn-screw mechanism that had been painted over so many times, the paint had become a kind of mortar. It took Arthur the better part of an afternoon to work it free. Below the trapdoor was a shallow equipment locker, maybe 18 inches deep, cut directly into the limestone. Inside it, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone brittle and brown at the edges, were 7 reels of magnetic recording tape. Each reel was labeled in a cramped, mechanical hand. Date, duration, a single word of classification that had been crossed out with a single black line on every single reel. The dates range from January of 1978 to November of 1978. Someone had been here before him. Someone had been listening before him. Now, here is where I need you to slow down with me. Not the story. You. Your breathing. Because what I'm about to describe to you is the specific quality of silence that exists inside a mountain. And to hear it properly, you'll need to breathe like you're already half inside one. Take a breath. Let it come slow. Let it come from low in your chest, where the ribs are wide. Hold it for just a moment at the top, and let it out. Slow, even, like water finding level. Again, in, out. That rhythm, that slow, unhurried exchange, is the same rhythm the mountain breathes. The earth's crust moves in cycles, so low, so deep, so spread across the length and breadth of geological time, that no human instrument was ever designed to hear them. Not directly, not in real time, but slowed down, sped up, manipulated. That is another matter entirely. Arthur's player was a Nagra reel-to-reel, a Swiss instrument, precise and heavy in the color of a World War II field canteen. He brought it because he sometimes made field recordings of his own, ambient industrial sounds, the kind that helped him sleep on assignment. He hadn't expected to need it as an investigative tool. He threaded the first reel, standard playback, 60 inches per second. What he heard was exactly what he expected to hear. White noise. The broadband hiss of magnetic oxide over a playback head. Somewhere buried in it, a very faint, very regular series of low-frequency thumps. The seismic baseline of the mountain, recorded at standard speed, translated to audio. The sound of the earth being the earth. The sound of limestone under pressure, of deep water moving through ancient cavities, of the planet doing its slow, patient geological housekeeping. He let it play for 3 minutes. He stopped it. He thought about it. The documentation that had come with the Nagra included a variable speed playback function, industrial grade, used for analyzing machinery signatures at compression, taking a long, slow process and collapsing it to a time scale the human ear could parse. The maximum ratio on the unit was listed as 1,000 to 1. 1,000 seconds of recording played back in a single second. Arthur did the math. 7 reels. Approximately 50 minutes of recording per reel. At 1,000 times speed, the full archive compressed to 21 seconds of audio. He set the playback ratio. He pressed play. He listened to it 4 times before he understood what he was hearing. The first time he thought it was equipment resonance. the artifact of an old machine playing old tape at a ratio it had never been designed for. The second time he thought it was pareidolia, the human mind's profound, almost desperate need to find pattern in chaos, to hear voice in wind, to see faces in the grain of old wood. The third time he took out his logbook and held a pen above a fresh page. He did not write anything. He couldn't. Because what he was hearing, what was rising out of that compressed, collapsed, 1,000 times accelerated record of the mountain's own deep body rhythm, was not resonance, was not pareidolia. It was a voice so low it vibrated the fillings in his back teeth. A voice that had no beginning and no end within the 21 seconds of compressed audio. Only a middle. Only the long, unrolling center of something being said. Something being said the way a mountain says things. Across decades. Across seasons. In a register so far below the threshold of human hearing that it had taken an agency with redacted letterhead and a dead silent limestone shack and 11 nights of continuous recording to capture even a fragment of it. A voice that was saying his name, not a name, his name. Arthur. Now, I need you to hear me very carefully about what happened next, because I've told this story before, told it to other men and women who sat in monitoring stations across the length of the Appalachian chain. And the part that always catches in the throat, the part that takes the most care to deliver, is not the terror of it. It's the recognition. That is the thing that undoes you. Not fear, not revulsion. Recognition. A deep vertebral understanding that you have heard this voice before, that you have been hearing it your whole life, in the half-second between waking and sleep, in the resonance of old pipes in old walls, in the sub-bass shudder of distant thunder that you feel in your sternum before you hear it with your ears. You have always known this voice. You simply had no mechanism to understand what it was saying. Until now. Arthur sat at his monitoring desk for a long time after the tape stopped. The seismograph needle moved in its slow, patient arc. The paper roll fed through the platen. The rain on the tin roof continued its soft, irregular percussion. The limestone walls breathed out their ancient chill. And Arthur, for the first time in his professional life, looked at the mountain's own record, that long, continuous, ink-traced line of amplitude and frequency, and read it differently. He had been reading it as data. Now he read it as language. The regular low-frequency baseline wasn't geological settling. The slow, heavy rhythm wasn't pressure normalization. The deep, unhurried 12-second interval between each major amplitude peak wasn't tectonic at all. It was respiratory. In, out, in, out. Arthur pulled the oldest log from the shack's filing cabinet, a water-stained ledger from 1968, when the station had first been established. He found what he was looking for on the third page, a note written in the same cramped mechanical hand as the tape labels, underlined twice with a ruler. The nest is positioned within a natural void in the limestone substrate. Approximate dimensions, 14 feet diameter. Walls are porous. Structure is not a cave. Structure appears to be a pore. Source formation undetermined. May extend significantly. A pore. The shack had been built inside a pore. Arthur set the ledger down very slowly. He looked at the floor, at that raw gray limestone, at the amber-tinted epoxy resin, at the 8-sided walls bolted into the living rock. He looked at the porthole windows, permanently fogged with condensation. Condensation. Not from the cold. Not from the temperature differential between the steel walls and the October air. From the moisture in the breath. The warm, mineral-laden, ancient breath of something that had been inhaling and exhaling in 12-second cycles since before the hemlock grew on the ridge, before the county was named, before the first human ear pressed against the limestone and heard something enormous turning over in its sleep beneath the roots of everything. The listener's nest was not a monitoring station. It was a pore. A single pore in a lung that, if the amplitude data was accurate, if the frequency signatures extrapolated the way Arthur's 22 years of vibration analysis told him they did, extended across the full width of Hettrick County, deep into the substrata, down through the limestone and the shale and the compressed black seams of coal that the old-timers called the dark ribs, down to a depth at which the rock was no longer fully solid, no longer fully distinct from the pressure around it, no longer quite rock in any way a geologist would recognize. Down to something that had been breathing. Down to something that had been breathing and dreaming. Down to something that had been dreaming in a register so low and so slow that the only way to hear its dream speech was to sit very still in an 8-sided room in an October dark hollow and compress a year of its voice into 21 seconds and hold a pen above a logbook and listen to the thing say your name with a patience and a certainty and a terrifying bottomless warmth that made the pen shake. The needle moved, slow, heavy, 12 seconds between each pass of the mechanical arm. In, out. Arthur did not leave the listener's nest that night. He sat at his desk. He breathed. And for the first time since his arrival on Sighing Ridge, he found himself breathing in rhythm, his chest rising as the needle rose, his chest falling as the needle fell. In, out. In, out. His coffee went cold. The propane burner guttered and died. The rain on the tin roof gentled to a mist and then to a stillness. The hemlock trees outside the porthole windows were motionless in the windless hollow, their black shapes pressed flat against a sky gone the deep charcoal gray of 4 in the morning. And underneath Arthur, underneath the epoxy and the limestone and the 40 feet of ridge, underneath the shale and the dark ribs and the deep water, something vast turned very slightly in its sleep, knew he was there, had always known he was there, had always known the names of the people who sat still and listened in the pour of its ancient lung, had been saying those names in that 12-second rhythm since 1978, since before, since always. The needle moved, in, out. Let your breathing follow it. There's no hurry here. The mountain has been waiting a long time. It can wait a little longer. In, out. Sleep now. The stone is warm. The needle is moving. The old lung is breathing, and you are already deep inside it.